That Tuesday started the way most Tuesdays do. Unremarkably, and slightly behind schedule. I had overslept by 11 minutes, which is enough to throw off the entire morning, without being enough to justify going back to bed. I skipped the shower I needed, made coffee in the dark, because I couldn't find the light switch for some reason, and left my apartment with my jacket half-zipped, and one earbud missing. Classic. My usual stop was Pages and Grounds on Bloor, a bookstore-cafe hybrid that had no right to be as good as it was. The kind of place that sold you a cortado and a used copy of something you didn't know you needed. I'd been going there every weekday for almost 2 years. The guy at the counter knew my order. I didn't even have to talk. Except that Tuesday there was a sign on the door. Hand-lettered, slightly crooked, closed for private event. Back Wednesday. Sorry. The exclamation mark felt aggressive under the circumstances. I stood there for a second, jacket still half-zipped, one earbud still missing, and accepted that the morning was going to ask more of me than I had planned for. There was another cafe 2 blocks east, one I'd walked past but never entered. Clements. It looked quiet from the outside, the kind of quiet that's either peaceful or slightly sad. I went in. Inside it smelled like dark roast and cardamom. Small tables, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu with handwriting that someone had clearly practiced. Not trendy, just honest. I got in line and stared at the menu even though I already knew I was getting a black coffee. That was when I felt it. That specific feeling of being watched. Not in an uncomfortable way, just noticed. I looked up. She was 2 people ahead of me in line, facing the counter, but her head was turned just slightly to the side. Enough that I could see her profile. Dark hair pulled back loosely, a gray wool coat that looked like it had been worn through at least 4 Canadian winters and kept anyway. She had a book tucked under one arm, spine out, though I couldn't read the title from where I stood. Then she turned a little more and looked directly at me. Not a glance. Not a polite, oops, I made eye contact look away. She just looked, measured and unhurried, the way people look at things they're genuinely curious about. I looked back. I didn't know what else to do. She held it for a moment, then turned back to the counter to order. I heard her voice, clear and even. Out latte, please. No syrup. Then she pulled out a card to pay, tucked the book tighter under her arm, and stepped to the side to wait. When I got to the register, I ordered my black coffees. Then I did something I genuinely cannot fully explain. I said, "Can I add an oat latte to that? The one that was just ordered." The guy at the register blinked. "She already paid." "I know. Can I? Is there a way to credit her or something?" He looked at me like I was a mildly interesting problem. "I can make her a second one." That was not what I meant. But I said yes before I could think it through, so I stood at the pickup counter, holding 2 coffees, which was not a position I had ever anticipated being in. She was a few feet away, back to the room, reading a page of her book while she waited. When the barista called oat latte, we both moved toward the counter. She reached for her cup. I was already holding one. I held it out toward her. She looked at the cup, then at me. "That's mine," she said. "I know. I got you a second one." "Why?" I had no prepared answer. I wanted to, and then I'd already said yes before I caught up with myself. She looked at me steadily. "You bought coffee for someone who had already bought their own coffee." In my defense, I didn't know that part until after. Something moved across her face. Not quite amusement. The suggestion of it. She took the cup anyway, held both of them, looked between them like she was considering the situation. "Thank you," she said, in a tone that made it clear she was not going to explain whether she meant it simply or ironically. Then she walked to a small corner table, set both cups down, opened her book, and started reading. I took my coffee and went to work. I thought about her on the subway. Not obsessively, just the way you think about a small thing that didn't go the way you expected. The book under her arm, the coat, the fact that she hadn't looked away first. I went back to Pages and Grounds on Wednesday when it reopened. Everything was normal. I ordered my usual, said nothing to anyone, and felt vaguely like I'd missed something. On Thursday morning, I walked 2 blocks east again. I told myself it was because Clements had good coffee, which it did, but it wasn't exactly the reason. She wasn't there Thursday or Friday. On Friday, I felt a little ridiculous, standing in line, scanning the room. I didn't know her name. I didn't know anything about her except her coffee order and the fact that she read standing up and looked at strangers without apology. That was not a lot to build on. Still, the corner table by the wall stayed empty, and I noticed. Monday, I went back to my usual cafe. Tuesday, I told myself I was going to Clements because it was closer to where I had an early meeting. That was partially true. She was there. Same corner table. Same gray coat, draped over the back of the chair. Book open this time, flat on the table, held open with one hand, while she wrote something in a small notebook with the other. 2 empty espresso cups off to the side. I ordered my coffee and stood at the pickup counter long enough to talk myself into something I wasn't sure about. Then I walked over. She looked up when I stopped beside the table. Not surprised. Not exactly. "You're back," she said. "I like the coffee here. You went somewhere else last Monday." I went still. "How do you know that?" She picked up her pen, tapped it once against the notebook. "I'll tell you later." Her name was Quincy Adler. She told me that about 20 minutes into a conversation that neither of us had formally agreed to have. I'd sat down when she gestured at the empty chair across from her. Not quite an invitation, but not a refusal either, and, somehow, we had started talking. She said her name the way people do when they're used to it, being repeated back with a question mark. I didn't repeat it with a question mark. "What do you do?" I asked. "Streams. I research things. That's not an answer. It's the accurate version of one." She looked up from her notebook. "Urban policy. I'm a researcher at U of T, mostly housing and zoning. Occasionally transit if someone needs to be annoyed." "Do you like it?" "I like being right," she said. "The work is a reasonable vehicle for that." I told her I worked in communications for a mid-sized nonprofit downtown. Arts funding, mostly. I told her I'd started because I believed in the mission, and I still did. Mostly, but some mornings, the gap between the work I was doing and the work I'd imagined doing felt wider than usual. Quincy listened to this without filling in the silence. When I finished, she said, "The gap or the fact that you keep measuring it?" I didn't have a good answer. She went back to her notebook like she hadn't just said something that would bother me for the rest of the day. It bothered me for the rest of the... After that, the corner table at Clements became something I navigated around without acknowledging. I would arrive around 8. She was almost always there first, coat on the chair, notebook open. The first week, she kept writing when I sat down. She'd answer questions, offer the occasional dry observation, then return to whatever she was working on. I found I didn't mind. It was actually pleasant, being in the same space as someone who wasn't performing sociability. Then one morning I sat down and she closed the notebook without being asked, set her pen on top, picked up her coffee. I noticed. I didn't say anything about it. "Don't," she said without looking at me. "I didn't do anything. You were about to make a face." "What kind of face?" "The kind people make when they think something is significant." "Is it not?" She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "My notebook is full. I'm waiting for a new one to be delivered." "Aha. So don't read into it." "I wasn't going to." "You absolutely were." I drank my coffee and said nothing. She almost smiled. The mornings built slowly after that. Not dramatically. There was no single moment that changed anything, just a series of small ones that accumulated weight. She remembered that I took my coffee, black. I learned she took exactly 2 oat lattes per morning and nothing afternoon, because caffeine afternoon, she said, was a commitment she wasn't willing to make. I learned she'd grown up in Winnipeg, moved to Toronto for her master's degree, and stayed because she'd become genuinely angry about local housing policy and couldn't do the work properly from far away. She said it plainly, like it was obvious. I found it was. One Thursday she mentioned offhandedly that there was a panel discussion that evening at the reference library. Urban planning, adaptive reuse of buildings, a few people she found interesting, and at least one she found insufferable. Sounds like a good time, I said. It's useful, she said. Useful and good are different. I'd go with you, I said. It came out before I'd finished deciding. She looked at me for a moment. You work in arts communications. You have no professional reason to attend. I find zoning genuinely fascinating. No one finds zoning genuinely fascinating. Then I'll be the exception. She held my gaze for a second, steady as always. It starts at 7. Don't be late. I hate waiting, and I won't pretend otherwise. I was there at 6:53. She was already inside. The panel was at the central branch of the Toronto Reference Library, in one of the upper floor rooms that looked out over the atrium. Quincy had a seat near the aisle already, her coat folded over the chair beside her. She handed me a printed program when I sat down, which meant she'd picked one up for me, which I decided not to mention. The discussion itself was good, dense and specific in the way I didn't know I liked until I was sitting there following it. Quincy was quiet during most of it, but I could see her take a breath before certain comments, like she was restraining herself. At one point the panelist she'd called insufferable said something about affordability that made her jaw tighten visibly. Afterward, in the lobby, she exhaled slowly. He's been wrong about that particular thing for 6 years and just keeps saying it with the same confidence. You could have said something. I did, in a paper I published in March. He cited it incorrectly in the same talk. She put her coat on with the efficient way she did everything. So yes, I could have said something. But I already did, and he apparently didn't read it. I laughed. She looked at me briefly. It's not funny. It's a little funny. It's infuriating. Both things can be true. She, almost, smiled at that. We walked out onto Yonge Street, into the kind of October evening Toronto does well. Cold enough to feel real, clear enough that you could see more sky than usual between the buildings. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not quite moving. Do you want to get dinner? I asked. There's a good ramen place on Bloor. She considered this the way she considered most things. Briefly but completely. Okay, she said. We walked west and talked about the panel and then about other things. She'd spent 2 summers doing fieldwork in northern Ontario, looking at housing gaps in smaller communities. She described one particular house meeting where she'd been the only person in the room, under 50, and the only one who'd read the provincial guidelines, and had therefore been accidentally in charge. She told the story without embellishment, and it was funnier for it. At dinner she asked about my work, more specifically than anyone had in a while. Not the mission statement version. What I actually did on a given Tuesday. What I thought about it honestly. I told her about a grant application I'd spent 3 weeks on that hadn't gone through, and how I'd spent a day being bitter about it, before realizing I hadn't actually believed in that particular program as much as I'd told myself. So what did you do? Wrote a better application for something I actually cared about. She nodded. Once. That's the right answer. It was the most straightforwardly approving thing she'd said to me. It landed differently than it would have from someone who offered approval more freely. Walking back to the subway, we passed a record store that was still open, lights warm behind the glass. I stopped without fully planning to. Inside, someone had put on something slow and instrumental. Quincy stood beside me on the sidewalk, both of us looking in at the store without saying anything for a moment. Then she said quietly, I like this kind of night. I looked at her. She wasn't looking at me, still watching the store, hands in her pockets. But there was something different in the set of her face. Less managed than usual. What kind? When the city feels like it's not trying so hard. I didn't have anything to add to that. I just stood there with her. For another moment, the music faint through the glass, until a cab went by and broke the quiet. At the subway entrance, she stopped. Thank you for coming tonight. At. Thank you for the program you saved me. She looked at me, and, this time her expression didn't stay controlled. She smiled. Not the restrained, almost smile I'd learned to watch for, but a real one, quick and a little surprised looking, like it had gotten out before she decided whether to let it. Then she went down the stairs. I walked home instead of taking the train. It was cold enough to need. The jacket zipped all the way, and I didn't mind. The next morning I arrived at Clements at 8 o'clock. Her corner table was empty. I ordered my coffee and sat somewhere else, because sitting at her table felt wrong. Answered some emails, waited. By 8:40 she still hadn't come in. I told myself she'd had a morning meeting, went to work. Wednesday she wasn't there either. Thursday I came in and saw for the first time that the corner table had someone else at it. 2 students with laptops, textbooks open. I got my coffee and stood by the window and felt, stupidly, like something had been moved without my permission. She hadn't texted. I realized I didn't have her number. I didn't know her department's direct line. I knew her coffee order, and that she'd grown up in Winnipeg, and that she thought zoning was a moral issue. That was all I had, and none of it was useful. By the following Monday, I had started going to Pages and Grounds again in the mornings. Not because it was better, just because Clements now had a specific absence in it that was harder to be around. On Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. There's a talk on Friday at Innis College. Short notice. You'd probably find it interesting. 6 p.m. QI stared at the message for a while. Then I typed, I'll be there. How did you get my number? She replied. You gave your card to the panel moderator on Thursday. He's a colleague. I sat back. I didn't remember giving anyone a card. But I had a habit of doing it automatically at events. I must have. Without thinking. Friday at Innis College was smaller than the library event. A seminar room, maybe 30 people. Folding chairs. A projector that took 4 minutes to connect. Quincy was near the back when I came in. She had saved a seat again, coat over the back this time, instead of on the chair beside her. Same thing, different method. The talk was about tenancy reform in British Columbia, given by a researcher from SFU. Quincy was more relaxed than the last event, I thought, because she agreed with the speaker. She asked 2 questions from the floor that were so precisely constructed. The speaker paused before answering both times. Afterward, we walked out into the October going on November cold, and stopped at a food cart on College for potato wedges. That were improbably good. We stood on the sidewalk eating them from a paper container, and she explained why the BC model couldn't be adopted in Ontario wholesale, but what the useful parts were. And I listened and asked things when I had them, and at some point I realized I had entirely stopped thinking about what I was going to say next, and was just listening, which almost never happened to me in conversation anymore. You went quiet, she said. I was listening. People usually do something while they listen. Look at their phone, plan their response. I didn't have a response planned. She looked at me. The streetlight made her face difficult to read, which I was slowly learning was sometimes on purpose and sometimes not. I should tell you something, she said. My stomach did a small, involuntary thing. Okay, I said. She handed me the paper container to hold, like she needed both hands free to say it. Then she looked down the street and back at me. The first morning at Clements wasn't random for me. I waited. I knew who you were before you came in. The street noise continued exactly as before. A streetcar went by on College. Someone nearby laughed at something. What does that mean? I asked. I'd been working on a cultural infrastructure project for 6 months. We were looking at arts funding models, specifically at mid-sized nonprofits with strong community records. Your organization was one of 3 I was reviewing. I'd read your grant applications. 2 pieces you'd written publicly. I'd found an interview you gave for a sector newsletter. I kept looking at her. She kept going. I'd been meaning to reach out professionally, but I kept putting it off. Then I was at Clements one morning. I go there most mornings. It's near my office. And I recognized you when you came in. And you watched me. Yes. Without saying anything. Yes, I thought about the first day. The way she'd held eye contact without looking away. The way she hadn't seemed surprised when I offered the coffee. The way she'd said I'll tell you later about knowing I'd been back. All of it reorganized itself into a different shape. You knew I'd come back, I said. That's how you knew I'd been there Tuesday and Wednesday. I was there too. I didn't approach because I hadn't decided what I wanted the conversation to be. A professional conversations initially. She said it evenly. That was what I'd told myself. I put the paper container down on a nearby ledge. I needed my hands free too, apparently. So, when I bought you the coffee, I was surprised by that. That wasn't something I'd accounted for. And you thought it was funny that I didn't know. You already knew who I was. I didn't think it was funny. She paused. I thought it was unexpected, and then it became something I didn't know how to correct without explaining what I'd been doing, which would have required explaining it sooner than I was ready to. The rational part of my brain understood the logic of that. Every step she'd described made its own kind of sense. She'd recognized someone relevant to her work. She'd been cautious. She'd delayed. And then the delay had grown into something she didn't know how to name. But there was another part of me, standing on the sidewalk on College Street, holding a container of potato wedges, that felt like the floor had shifted slightly underfoot. I need to think, I said. Quincy nodded once. She didn't argue, didn't reach for me, didn't try to fill the space with reassurance, which, even then, I recognized was consistent with who she was. She gave people room. Whether that was generosity or self-protection, I still couldn't tell. Okay, she said. I called a lift. She waited until it arrived, which I thought she might not. Before I got in, she said, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I nodded. Got in the car. On the way home, I looked out the window and tried to figure out what I actually felt. Past the first layer of it. The first layer was something like embarrassment. The retroactive feeling of having been in a situation whose real dimensions I hadn't known. That feeling that the other person had the map and you were navigating by guesswork. But underneath it, I thought about the notebook she closed when I sat down, the program she picked up for me at the library. The way she'd listened when I talked about the grant application, not to collect data but because she'd wanted to know what I actually thought. The thing she'd said about the city not trying so hard. Those hadn't been strategic. I didn't think so. Anyway, the car turned onto my street, and I still didn't know what I thought. I spent the weekend doing the kind of things that look like productivity, but aren't. Cleaned my kitchen. Did a long run along the waterfront trail in the cold. Went to my sister's place for dinner on Saturday, and sat through a conversation about her renovation plans, while only partially present. She noticed. You're doing that thing, she said. What thing? The thing where you're here, but you're also thinking about something, and you keep almost saying it and then not saying it. That was an accurate description. I didn't confirm or deny it. She handed me more pasta and let it go, which was one of the things I'd always been grateful for about her. By Sunday afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a coffee that had gone cold, and I had arrived somewhere. Not a conclusion exactly. More like a clear enough view of what was actually bothering me. The start had been deliberate. That mattered. I didn't want to minimize it, because the alternative was dishonest. She had known who I was, positioned herself in a situation where we might speak, and then let me believe the first meeting had been luck when it hadn't. But she had also told me she hadn't waited until it didn't matter, or until telling me cost her nothing. She'd told me at the exact moment when doing so was most likely to change things between us. That cost her something. I didn't think she'd done it easily, and the research that had brought her to Clements in the first place. She hadn't manufactured the professional relevance. My organization was doing real work. She'd had a real reason to know about it. She hadn't invented an interest in me from nowhere. She'd just failed to introduce herself the normal way and then gotten in too deep trying to find a better moment. I picked up my phone, found her contact, typed, "Can we meet? Clements. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, she replied in 4 minutes. I'll be there. She was already at the corner table when I arrived, which I expected. No notebook, no book, just her, and a flat white she was holding, but not drinking. I ordered my coffee and went over, sat down. She looked at me without performing calm, which was different than usual. She was actually a little uncertain. I could see it in the way she was sitting. Just less organized than normal. The first morning bothered me, I said. I know. Not because you had a reason to know who I was. That part I understand. Because you let me believe it was chance when it wasn't. That's the part that sat badly. She nodded. She didn't try to explain it away. I don't want to be managed, I said. I don't want someone deciding what I get to know about how we got here. That's fair. I'm not done, she waited. But I've been thinking about what you did and didn't do. And you told me, at the exact moment you knew it would cost you something. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. That's not nothing. Quincy looked down at her flat white, then back up. I almost didn't say anything, she said. I had almost convinced myself it wasn't relevant anymore, that enough time had passed that the beginning didn't matter. What, changed your mind? She was quiet for a moment. The night at the library, you said you'd written a better grant application for something you actually cared about. I kept thinking about that afterward, about the version of things that's technically defensible versus the version that's actually honest. She picked up her cup, put it down again. I didn't want to be in something that was technically fine. That was, I thought, probably the most Quincy Adler sentence she had ever said to me. If we're going to keep doing this, I said, I need honesty to come before strategy. Yes, even when it's inconvenient. Especially then, she said. I know. A pause. I'm not sure I'm naturally good at that. I'm not asking you to be naturally good at it. I'm asking you to try. She looked at me for a long moment. Outside the window, a cyclist went by, and a woman pushed a stroller past in the light November drizzle, and the street did its ordinary thing without knowing or caring what was happening at the corner table inside. Okay, Quincy said, simply and without qualification. I nodded. Drank my coffee. She picked up a pen from somewhere. It had appeared from her coat pocket, because of course she always had one, and wrote something on the back of the paper sleeve from her coffee cup. She slid it across the table. 4 words. No more managed beginnings. I looked at it for a moment, folded it once, and put it in my jacket pocket. We sat there while the cafe filled up slowly around us, the way it did every morning. The familiar sounds of grinding coffee and low conversation and rain tapping against the windows. At some point she pulled out a new notebook, the replacement that had been delivered, apparently, and opened it. Then she glanced at me. Don't read anything into the notebook, she said. I wasn't. The other one ran out. It's not a metaphor. I wasn't going to say anything. She uncapped her pen. You were making the face. I was making the face a little. It probably was slightly metaphorical, but I didn't say so. Because some things didn't need to be said. And because Quincy Adler, across the corner table at Clements, on a rainy Tuesday morning, was writing something in a new notebook, with the careful focused attention she gave to everything. And whatever it was, she hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be for work or not, and I was content, for now, not to ask.